Welcome to the Open Door Initiative, a segment of On Purpose coaching and consulting. And I am your host, Coach Joanie or Joanie, or whatever it is that you want to call me. I have so many nicknames, but I just want to welcome my two friends on tonight. They are here to help me talk about how do we make sustainable change? How do we push forward and start to break down the different perspectives of what that's going to take, because that's exactly what it looks like. So we want to be open to hear, open to learn, open to educate, and open to taking practical steps forward. So let me welcome my two darling sisters on tonight, Miss Crystal and Rebekah. Yes, I got y'all, boo. I got you.
Not looking like that tonight, though.
Yes.
Yeah, you used the good picture. Thank you.
I did.
Right. I'm like, oh, wow, I'm honored.
So we want to talk about today traversing the ability to have true expression, right? How do we have open and honest dialogue with our friends, our family, and even with our folks in church? And I'm going to fix that typo now that I just see that the T is missing on honest. We're going to get that together. Jesus, take the wheel.
Amen.
So all my Enneagram ones out there, I am sorry, but we're going to do better on purpose next time.
Amen.
So I just first and foremost, I definitely want you both to introduce yourself, and I'll start with you, Miss Rebekah. Just to, give me a brief background of who you are, and then we'll hop in. So nothing, don't think you have to go through a resume or anything, but just, tell us.
Amen. Okay, well, again, I'm so grateful to be here, truly honored at the invitation. I love both of these women so much, and they have both made a significant impact on my life, even in the very succinct time that I've had the pleasure of knowing them. So it really is a privilege to be here with you ladies and speaking to all of our brothers and sisters that are listening. So again, my name is Rebekah Sharpe. I'm a sister, a daughter, a friend, but most importantly, like a daughter of the Most High God. I love me some Jesus, y'all. So that's what you're going to get from me tonight. Yeah, exactly. And, so I just moved to Detroit, Michigan. I work for Ford Motor Company during the day, but I also like to say I work for the kingdom of God, because that's what I'm constantly trying to advance in any time that I have. And this time has really revealed to me that the earth is groaning for the revelation of the sons and daughters of God. So this is the perfect time for us to arise and shine, because our light has surely come. So before I preach a sermon, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to my sister Crystal to introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I am Crystal DeGruttola. I'm not going to be nearly as fantastically articulate as Rebekah, but I grew up basically a pastor's kid in ministry. I myself have served in ministry by choice for the past 20 years, multiple different capacities, different types of ministries, both just in volunteer positions as well as leadership positions. I am a Jesus follower to the core. My life revolves around this idea that discipleship can happen in any people group, anywhere in the world. Because that's the way that it was designed to. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation, coming at it from that perspective. I'm also a wife and a mother to two very special people. My daughter is just like me, so we hit heads all the time. My husband is my opposite, so we bump heads all the time. I mean, that's kind of life. So,
yes.
Beautiful.
That works out. So I'm used to confronting I have been learning how to do that, both as a wife and a mother, and even more recently as a better friend, I should say.
Yeah.
Amen. That's good.
Yeah, so let's hop right in, because that's exactly, you hit it right there, Chris. We have so much trouble coming to the table, right? Because people just don't want conflict, and they just don't, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to deal with it. Why can't we just all get along, right? Why do you think, and I'll start with you, why do you think that is? What is the trouble with open and honest dialogue?
Honestly, I think it's this whole idea that has been perpetuated, that there is a your truth and there's a my truth. And I think what that has done, it has caused people to pigeonhole themselves into their own perspective. Yeah. So when they get into a conversation, it's not that their intent isn't to listen. I just think we've lost the nuance of what that actually looks like.
Yeah.
I think that what has happened is because of this whole, like, your truth is for you and my truth is for me, we've made all truth relative, so that, you know, in that type of an environment, in those kinds of conversations, then there is no truth at all.
That's right.
So when we are confronted with it, it's almost always a negative experience, whether we intend it to be or not, because truth hurts a lot.
Yeah.
And especially in conversations like this, like, you know, when you're talking about race, when you're talking about socioeconomic class, when you're talking about things like mental health and the disparity that occurs within that field, and the stigma that exists there, you know, so those types of conversations, when you try to present real truth, it hurts, and it's such an affront to people that we automatically default to what our perspective is. So even if our intent is to listen, the result is often to simply silence the other person once we get uncomfortable.
That's good. How about what do you think, Ms. Rebekah?
Yeah, I mean, that was such a powerful response. It was interesting. I was doing a little bit of reading, and I found myself on Inc., which is a business publication, and they had a quick stat saying that according to a workplace startup, Braverly, 70% of employees are avoiding difficult conversations with their bosses, colleagues, and direct reports.
Wow.
And so, I mean, that's 7 out of 10 people that are afraid to engage in difficult conversations at work. We spend the majority of our time at work, you know, so I'm not sure what those numbers look like. I know in church or in family or in relationships, but I would reckon that they're likely equally as high, right? And so I think that there's something within our, you know, genetic makeup as humans that prevents us from being uncomfortable. We don't want to be uncomfortable. So we would just like to stay sort of in our little box that we've created, where we can have conversations that sort of cater to us and cater to our thoughts and our ideologies and our experiences. And no one's really reaching across the aisle to actually get uncomfortable and to begin to lean into what doesn't always feel right, but it's going to end up being right, and it's going to work for your good. I love the scripture, Matthew 7:7-8, that says, ask and it shall be given, seek and you shall find, knock and it will be open. Yes. You know, there's a chart that's proactive. You got to go after something. You've got to chase it down. You've got to search for it. So people don't have that sort of like fortitude when it comes to having the conversations. And I just believe it's part of just our humanity and our carnal nature that keeps us from really being proactive and leaning into the uncomfortable and unknown places and spaces that might reveal some areas within us that, you know, still need to be worked on.
That is so true. And I was listening to a podcast last week. Patrick Lencioni was talking about, you know, he writes about the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and his pivotal piece he hinges on is trust. And he says when trust is not there, it's hard to engage with another individual. But if trust is there, getting to the truth is nothing but a pursuit towards the best right answer. And
that's good.
I think sometimes because that trust is lacking, because there's no relationship, there's no genuine just we all have a care and a concern for one another, that kind of stops us. And I think that that's caused by offense. So what is it that you think, Chris, triggers offense in us? Why are we already offended before we've even started?
Oh man, I think it's because we view the world through a very finite lens. And that lens is constructed by our experience, and nobody's experience is the same. Right. So if that's how we're viewing the entire world, then we're already approaching a situation with a skewed point of view. We're already approaching people through an incorrect lens, right? So depending on our experience and how we grew up and how we were taught to communicate, how we saw conflict being dealt with, right? I think that kind of shapes and it begins to form our psyche around how we prefer to approach people and how we prefer to be approached. So I think a lot of that comes into play. And so when you're talking about uncomfortable conversations, people do try to avoid them most of the time because they don't know how the other person's going to respond, but they're also not sure if they can control their own response. And so then what does that do? It opens the door for the spirit of fear to come in and to say, okay, well, you should probably just be silent, right? You probably just shouldn't say anything. Or it flips it to the other side and says, you know what, if you don't address this right now, then your life is going to be destroyed, right? And so then it flips. So it's either we either go from extremely passive then to extremely aggressive and violent. This middle ground seems to have been lost.
Yeah, that assertiveness.
So I don't know. I mean, and outside of being able to have honest conversations about our experience and what formed our lens, I don't know that we'll be able to fix that.
So what are some of those constructs you've brought along with you in your storyline? What are
okay, so for example, when I was growing up, my mother and I had a very contentious relationship. My mother was a screamer. She went from 0 to 160 in like 0.2 seconds. And the relationship was extremely unhealthy. Okay, so my experience in conflict with her was very negative. But then I also grew up watching that play out in her marriage, right? And the effect that had on their marriage relationship. And God bless them now. I mean, they are healthier now than they've ever been. But when I was a kid, they were kids. I mean, we're talking, my parents were married at 17 and 18 years old.
Oh, wow.
So they were young kids trying to learn how to parent, right? So when I finally got to an age where I could decide how I was going to deal with conflict, I knew I didn't want to be my mom. But I also knew that I didn't want to be handled the way that my dad handled my mom. So I think when I started to find myself in situations of confrontation, I wasn't afraid of it necessarily because I'd already grown up with so much of it. But what I found was that my not being afraid of it scared other people. So I always found myself in these really tense conversations where I was always misunderstood because I was trying to so avoid ending up in either of the unhealthy extreme that I couldn't communicate clearly. So I ended up just kind of retreating most of the time. And choosing not to speak. I became one of those people.
Well, and I feel like that's where a lot of our brothers and sisters are, even in the white community are, because they're like, I don't know what the right thing is to say. I don't know whether or not someone's going to get mad at me if I don't ask the right thing or if I say the wrong thing. So Rebekah,
I'd like to just jump.
Well,
I just want to jump into something that you brought up. I was hoping we'd get to it. So I follow a pastor, we all follow pastors and faith leaders and whatnot, named Havilah Cunnington. She was a pastor at Bethel in Reading. And so, that's a traditionally conservative church. I've seen some of their statements on what's going on right now, but ultimately, they are a conservative group of individuals. And last night, Havilah posted something that was pretty much praising police officers and just talking about all of the different things that they go through in terms of, dealing with people in their last breath and, intervening during different domestic situations and having to show up in the midst of danger, all of these very noble things that police officers do, right? So she posts this and she's like, and I support police. Well, immediately her comment section just blew up. Like people couldn't believe, like there were some people that were like, yeah, we support you, Havilah, we're with you. And then of course there are some people, mainly Black folks, who were just crushed. Like, Havilah, I didn't expect this from you. I can't believe that someone of your rapport would post something like this at this time. That's what people kept saying, at this time. So next thing I know, she hops on her live and she's in tears and she's like, I'm so sorry. Like, you're right. It's not the right timing. And I didn't post this with wisdom, and I'm removing the post. And it's not because I don't agree with those sentiments. I do support police, but I recognize, given everything that's going on and the way that my Black brothers and sisters are hurting right now, that post only added fuel to their fire. So I used that example, and I was so, grateful that I was able to kind of see it play out right before our conversation, because, she was proactive. She leaned in. She was not afraid to apologize and to say, you know what, and to see it from somebody else's perspective and recognize, like, I believe these sentiments. I do believe that there are good, and we know that there are good police officers, right? But given what people are going through right now and how that's such a trigger for a whole people group, she recognized and was willing to say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. We're not always going to say or do the right things, but please have grace with me. Like, just be willing to work with me as we all navigate this time. And I just thought that was such a beautiful example of, like, empathetic leadership, and just us really, like, we're charting uncharted territory together. So we do have to have that grace element. And I was really proud of just her bravery and courage to stand up, say she was wrong, get on her live, tears in her eyes, the eyelash falling off. Like, it was very raw and authentic and real. And I'm just like, this is so amazing. And I really appreciated that moment of vulnerability from her.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Chris?
I mean, I honestly, I'm torn when it comes to that kind of stuff. Yeah. Because for me, I am of the personality that I want all voices at the table. Mm-hmm. And my question immediately to that is, okay, if the time isn't now, then when is it? Mm-hmm. Because if we can't come to the table, if everybody can't come to the table and all perspectives can't be heard in the midst of something, mm-hmm. then you lose, right? You automatically lose, because one of the groups that should be speaking isn't speaking. Right, which automatically means some of the groups that should be being heard aren't being heard. Okay, so then once their turn, right, comes up, because that's essentially what we're saying, is that it's not their turn right now. Okay. But by the time their turn does come up, the emotion's out of the situation. Either that, or the emotion is so charged that we're still stuck in a space where nobody's listening. Right. So I think for me, like, not that I'm not saying she shouldn't have apologized. Like, obviously that is between her and the people who follow her and whatever else. Like, I'm not saying that. But I guess my question becomes, because I've been seeing that a lot, honestly, where white people are saying something, right, trying to be supportive of yet another group that now, I mean, because if we're gonna speak truth, the police are now in a position where they are starting to be oppressed and they are now not protected. Okay, so if we're going to speak truth, then we have to acknowledge that, right? And we have to acknowledge then that their voices also now need to be important. And I'm watching a lot of people post things in support of police, and they're getting the same response. I'm just so disappointed you would say that right now. Okay, well, when am I supposed to say it? When is it okay then for me to acknowledge that in trying to bring awareness to an oppressed people, we're now choosing to oppress another group? Because for me, that's not okay. Like, neither one's okay. So first, like, I just want a space where everybody comes to the table, everybody's voice gets heard. And if we're going to say we want to hear all perspectives, then we need to be actually real with that and hear all perspectives. We need to allow all parties to speak, because if we don't, we lose. We all lose.
Okay. So what do you got on that, sister?
Yeah, I think about Solomon's words in Ecclesiastes, that there's a time for every activity under heaven. And I think in this moment, we need to mourn with those who are mourning. I don't necessarily agree that police are being, like, oppression, that word, and I'd have to define it to really get a full understanding. But I think with the way that at least I have learned it now and that I understand it today, is that they don't have any power. And I mean, they still have power. There's obviously campaigns for them to be for funding to kind of move out of the departments and in more to the communities, but they still very much have power. They're still very much operating with this sense of protecting and serving in various communities, as we've seen throughout all of these protests and riots and things like that. The police are still very much out there in a force. And so I just feel like in this, I get what you're saying, Chris, and I know your heart in that, but I think in this moment, it is very insensitive to have every single voice at the table, because to be quite frank, white people have had the heads of the tables for 400 plus years in this country. I don't know if they, and not that you all don't need to talk at all, but I think you probably should do more listening in this season and more trying to learn and understand than to have your perspective at the table right now, because things are too fresh. I know it feels like a several hundred years, but it's only been a week since, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, so it's still very fresh, and it has been such a triggering moment for so many of us that all these other wounds and hurts and pains are coming up. So I think we just need some time to work through that before we can hear this other voice that is supporting of the police, because that's triggering to me. That automatically makes me feel like, wow, you don't care about this lengthy list of my brothers and sisters that have been killed at their hands. And I love you, so I'm not coming after you, but I'm just sharing the perspective of how triggering that can be in this moment, because it's so fresh.
Absolutely. And I thought my aunt brought up something really good on the last podcast. She just said how for the entirety of America, basically, Black people have learned how to live through the white lens, i.e., and I think we were talking about this, Chris, it's how the books are set up. It's how history books are. It's how, again, I have to dress and look a certain way when I go to corporate America, right? Based on how I'm basing it, this is the way it should be. And she brought up a good point that, and it's sentiments of what you were just saying, Bex, is that at what point do we stop having to say, I'm trying to educate you and I'm trying to tell you, versus let me go do some homework and understand the Black perspective and understand their history. And she was saying how, and my mom, how it gets suppressed, or why we don't talk about it, is because we have to bring up racism and we have to bring up slavery, because it's a part of our history. We don't get to say that's not a part of our history, right? So it gets squashed a lot. And like, how do you feel about that? Because I thought that was I was like, oh, that's an aha, because I never really thought about that we learn how to live in white America, but white Americans don't have to learn how to live in any other culture, if that makes sense.
Right.
That makes sense.
And that's the white privilege, yeah.
Like, what does that speak to you when I say that? Like, because I just thought that was a different perspective. I was like, that makes sense. I could see where she was like coming from. Like, what do you think?
Who's that to? Crystal or myself?
Oh, sorry, Chris. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Oh, to me?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you were sorry. That's what I meant.
I'm like, is the video frozen?
I thought you said Bex, so I'm like, okay.
Oh, sorry. I was hearing it as I was talking.
I'm sorry. Repeat the question.
So she brought up the perspective that
right, that whites, we don't have to learn about. Okay. I honestly have had an issue with the way they teach American history since I was taking American history. I grew up with Black members of my family. So I'm not like, I don't want to say, I hate to say typical, but I guess in today's world, I'm not like the typical white person. They got an all white education, believed everything in my history book, and walked away going, right? So I learned about Rosewood. I learned about Tulsa. I learned about the massacre, right? And how it got covered up by government. The very people that were supposed to be protecting the Black community, that had promised to do so, right? So I grew up hearing those conversations. So I kind of had a window into that, and I grew up having those conversations. So when I actually got to a grade level where they started teaching us about slavery, and I realized how much was missing, it didn't make sense to me. I didn't understand. But wait, like what about this? And what about this? And what about that? Oh, well, we don't talk about that. Well, why don't we talk about that?
Right.
You know, it's absolutely not fair. The fact that the educational system itself is failing, not just failing the African American community, but it's also failing the white community.
Everybody.
The fact that we're not talking about this is part of the problem that we're in today.
Yes.
Right. So if we would have learned those things, would it be different now? Right? If my generation would have learned in school what really happened to those communities, if we would have learned in school that, you know, between 1940 and 1960, the African American community was actually one of the most prosperous communities, like fastest growing ever in history, until legislation came in, right? So post-war, right? But then legislation came in, and what did we do? White men who had too much power imposed laws that caused destruction of the African American family. We removed the socioeconomic respect from the African American community because we removed their jobs and we sent them overseas, right? Because we overtaxed companies, and when you overtax companies, companies move. So what did they do? They moved out of African American communities and they went overseas. Okay, so we destroyed their family, we took their jobs, right? So you're talking what, 70s, 80s, and 90s. White people stood by and allowed legislation to come into play. And these politicians, we allowed them to admit that they knew it was going to be disparaging to the African American community and all other minorities, and we watched them push it through anyway. Right? And then we watched them rewrite our history. And we allowed them to do that and then hijack the education of our children. Okay, so for me, it's not fair. It needs to be changed. The fact that white people can grow up not having to understand, right, what Black people went through, therefore understanding why they feel the way that they do, the perspective that they're coming from, I don't agree with it at all. I believe it needs to change. But until we start to realize that the very people that are being voted into office to protect the Black community, because that's what they're saying they stand on, are the very people that are also enacting legislation that they understand is going to hurt the Black community. And we're stuck in this huge machine and cycle that's just ongoing. And so, how do you stop that so that you can say, okay, we need to educate both sides? Right? The white people need to be able to sit and listen and understand, like, this was real. It happened. Right? We can't hide this anymore. We're not going to shove under the rug that, what's her last name?
Bridges.
65. She's only 65. So we're not talking about something that was over 100 years ago. We're talking
not at all.
History. Okay, so that's a lot of our parents.
Exactly.
Right? So why didn't our parents teach us? Like, that becomes, so I end up with, like, and my mind goes in all of these different directions, and I'm like, education could have solved some of this. Not all of it.
No, not all of it.
It could have made a big dent, in helping to prevent where we are now.
What do you think? What were you about to say back?
So many things. But I want to really honor you, though, Crystal, and also affirm that you are like a sign and a miracle and a wonder, because you are the exception and not the rule, right? So I appreciate how passionately you speak to these topics, how well educated you are, on what has occurred in our community. But that is not the lion's share, as you know. So there are some people, right? And even myself, I had to really understand. And I think that's why I was really struggling with, like, compounding grief last week, is because I had to realize, because I've been trained in such a way to operate in corporate America, in white evangelical circles with my white friends, I bought into some of the systemic racism and the ideals of white supremacy, and really thinking that I was subservient because of the color of my skin. I literally, these were fortified arguments that I had in my mind that I'm now having to unlearn, and I'm a Black woman. So we recognize, we talk about education, but there was a very specific agenda, right? The people that own the education systems and the ones that are like at the helm of these systems in our society, they're white men.
Yeah.
And so they have the agenda. They're the ones that literally have the power and the influence to shape. And that's what we saw. That's the fruit that we're seeing today. Now that, there's a lot more access to information and people are really using their voices and all these perspectives are coming in, and we're learning more and more about these injustices and the systemic racism in every facet of society. It's like they kept this information from us because they knew that if we really knew what was going on, the revolution would have started much sooner than this, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And it has in some pockets, I think, which is why, there have been a lot of Black people who have left the church and who have left Christianity because they believe that this is a white man's religion and that white people, and that's a whole nother topic, but it's like, but those are the ones that are kind of bucking the system and saying, no, like read all these pictures of white Jesus. He was born in Nazareth. You know what I mean? Like, those were the images that I was fed too growing up. So that's literally what I thought it was, Right. So I have to understand how I have been sort of a purveyor of this very white supremacist supremacy narrative. And I'm trying to unlearn that in this season. And I think that kind of contributed to some of the rage that I felt like I had just been like bamboozled for so much of my life. Because I bought into a lot of these systems, given just the way that I've come up and how I've been educated and trained and, operating as a Black face in these white spaces. So, but I do, of course, want to bring up the fact there's a spiritual undercurrent to all of this. And we recognize that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. There's principalities, there's powers, there's rulers, and spiritual wickedness in high places. And one of my favorite pastors, Torrey, broke it down this weekend. He said, our principalities create ideologies and ideologies create systems. Yes. And I just thought that was so powerful. And I recognize that we all have a lane. Some people are called to tear down these principalities. Yeah. Some people are called, maybe like psychologists and sociologists are there to help like reform these ideologies. And then there's some people like in the political system, in the business world, that are called to kind of shape some of these new systems, right? Or reshape the systems. Yeah. But I think it's important for us to all recognize, because I know I felt like there's so much I want to do, but I'm only one person. Where can I even start? But I realized, like, Rebekah, you're here to pull down some of these strongholds and to break some of these chains and these principalities that have been operating for far too long, that have allowed these types of ideologies and systems to continue to flourish generation after generation. So I think it's also important for us to recognize what our lane is and to be very committed and devoted. And not that there can't be intersectionality there, but to just be committed and devoted to what God has called you to in a particular season. Some people some people plant the seeds, other ones water, but He is faithful to bring forth the growth. So that's been sort of helping me as I navigate and approach how I am bringing sustainable change in this season.
And that's so good. And I definitely agree with what you were saying. Like, after I heard, Dr. Anita, like, I literally was like, okay, Joanie, where have you been in this fight?
Right.
Like, I literally did, like, to your point, like, I did all of what I was supposed to do, and I went to college, and I got all these degrees, and I, did these things, and I'm just like, no, I'm lost. I'm like, wait, we got some, so I understand that. There's a work that's been, like, and that's where this initiative was born out of. It's just like, there has to be some peeling back of that onion, because
on both sides.
And decades and decades of what you're supposed to be doing versus this is what God wants you to be doing. And second piece you hit on, it was so funny. I like started screaming in my head, Crystal, because Dr. Chris House hit on Nehemiah. And I was like, oh, that's what we did in Bible study on Monday. And then back to you, Bex, he was saying, yes, he went out, he assessed. He reviewed, he got resources, support, understood what everybody had to do. And to your point about that lane, he was like, and everybody had their piece of the wall to rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, it's everybody has their piece of the wall. We're not doing the whole thing. And he was talking about how some pieces were crumbled, some pieces were completely missing, some were just needed a little patchwork, and there's different people working on those different focuses. And then he even talked about how, but the gates were completely decimated, and you got to protect your core, right? If I don't have gates, doesn't matter how much great work I'm doing, the enemy can still come inside and destroy. And that was that biggest piece there that I took from what he talked about was we got to prioritize as a people. Where do we start?
Where do we start?
To your point, there's so many pieces that needs to be fixed. Everybody has different pieces that they're supposed to be doing. And I think that's kind of, in my mind, that's what's missing. We don't have that leader that is at the helm of this, especially in the body, that is saying, or if it's a group within the body, that is saying, you know, here's our first step. Like, this is what this looks like, because to Sister Rebekah's point, yes, there are people who are meant to be doing spiritual warfare and that are meant to be driving, and we all do that as believers, absolutely. But there's also people to a point like myself. God knows me. He knows that I need to be doing something.
And
I'm glad
you are. So kudos to you, because you are doing something, and you're using your gifts and your talents to elevate and amplify voices. So thank you.
And I'm still, and like you said, and I'm still praying against these, you know, these strongholds and these divisiveness and all of the strife and the things that are going on. But and I know that there's people who are working in other ways to help the community, because like I told someone the other day, like, this is twofold. Yes, there's some education and some action that needs to be done within our white community, especially around legislation, laws, because you all have the power at the end of the day. So take that. But then over here, the Black community as well, we have things that we need to do and get our families back together. My mom mentioned tonight she wants to start a men's prison initiative where we're taking care of the young men that are in there, making sure, you know, they're being taken care of. There's nothing happening with them while they're in there, helping them get rehabilitated, and then giving them proper opportunities once they get out to help rebuild the family, right? Because they have kids on the outside. And so therefore, if you're telling me I can't vote, which means I can't change legislation, you're telling me I can't get a job, so I can't take care of my family. It perpetuates the cycle. So they're in there because they deserve to be in there. They did what they did. But once
maybe because that's another complex. Right. Systemic racism is so insidious, and I'm a daughter of somebody who spent time in prison. Like I'm aware of that system, and I've been a part of it in growing up. So we can't even put too much faith in things. Some people, criminals of all colors, but others, you know.
So the ones that
can't, like, and if I can even jump back for a second to what Bex was talking about before, I think part of this too, like, honestly, I think white people are starting to realize we've been lied to too.
And that's exactly what my brother said earlier.
And honestly, like, because the more conversations I'm having with white friends, they're just now in their adulthood coming to this realization that, like, they've been lied to. And what they've been taught isn't right. And what they were told about, you know, why certain legislation exists isn't right. You know, so I think that's part of it too, is that there are factions of white people waking up to this reality that, we did put entire communities and an entire generation of Black men in prison. And there's a very high probability that they shouldn't be there. So, I mean, that's like all of this is like, I mean, it's such a multi-layered thing now. And how do you
I was just
get to a point of being able to consume all of that and then talk about it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's the powerful piece, because I mean, there's an awakening that's happening, right? The tide is turning in our nation. I think that's why we see, first of all, every state in this country was represented in some sort of a protest, and I can't wait to really see the data on just how, but from the images, just how mixed these groups are. You know, our parents and our grandparents are absolutely astounded at how many white people there are out there, and how it's the white people that are, you know, taking down these statues, and it's the white people that are having conversations with their parents, and it's the white, you know, like, they can't believe it, because it wasn't like that during the civil rights movement. There was a few, of course, that were sprinkled in, but the awakening is happening, and you can see that in the number of individuals that have really rallied around the causes all over the nation. Yeah. You know, and are just so galvanized by this movement. And so I agree with you. I think that completely underscores what you're saying, that people are not realizing they've been lied to, you know, and they've been flabbergasted and bamboozled too. Now the system benefited them, so it's a little bit different. You know, they don't maybe have as much like rage, because they haven't, you know, really felt it and lived with it like we have. But I think just that aha and that revelation we're really seeing that played out all over the country. And I just feel like, you know, injustice and systemic racism was so strategic and intentional. So we have to be very strategic and intentional with dismantling it. You know, it's not just like, oh, let me just throw an arrow out there and see where it lands. No, we mourn, we cry, we lament, you know, all of that. We protest, we go through all of those, you know, kind of folds. But at some point we got to sit down and get real strategic and intentional on how we're really going to affect and sustain change, so that for your baby girl and her children, that this world is truly a more equitable and safe place for all. And for the unborn children of both Coach Jay and I too. But I know Bella is, she's here already. But you know, we have to think about that. It's the generational blessing.
Yes. Bella and her generation, I'm telling you, there's a power. There's a power there. And I'm excited to see what happens with it. But I am going, honestly, I agree with what you just said, and I'm going to throw it at the church, because we're the ones who know better.
Come on. Right? Do we know better? Let's talk about it, though. Let's unpack this. Do we know better? Do we know better? Or have they been bamboozled and lied to as well?
But see, it's simple for me.
Sorry.
Paul was very clear. Right? Nobody inside of the church should be holding anyone outside of the church to a biblical standard, period. We're the ones that know right from wrong. We're the ones that are supposed to know evil when we see it. We're the ones that are supposed to confront evil when we see it, right? And the reality is the church needs to start to stand up and realize and repent that we shut up and shored up. And when we did that, we allowed political control to occur. We allowed this oppression to be perpetuated because we decided to say nothing. Okay, and in the midst of all of that, and I can't even say the church broad spectrum, the white church. Okay, because we wouldn't even let the Black community into our churches because you all worshiped differently than we did.
Come on, that demonstrative praise. But I realize that worship is born out of our experience. You know, that's from all that pain and oppression, like, it's coming out.
But like we do that, like white people do that to each other, right? But we did it to such a degree that not did we just make you feel like you were doing it wrong, right? We made you feel like it was unacceptable to the point that you went out and had to open your own churches to worship. Okay, that is laid squarely at the feet, in my mind, of the white church. Okay, where in the heck was Jesus in that? Because for me, he was present, but I guarantee you he was mourning that moment.
Yeah.
Because why is that even a part of the church history? Right? Paul is very clear. Okay, so we are supposed to be confronting each other in love. Yeah. Right? If I see someone within the body sinning and I don't confront it, their blood is on my hands. Okay, so I don't understand how the church is now jumping into this feeling like, oh, we can confront everybody else. right? Let's point out the problem and everybody else outside of the church. No, let's start
on the
inside,
yeah.
right?
Ourselves. Yeah, and I never understood that, especially just how, and I know that there's history to this, but as I've kind of come up in the white evangelical circles of present, how they could be so committed to this issue of pro-life, you know, but then you don't care about little Black boys that are dying. And that was just such a conundrum to me. I'm perplexed, you know, that we can literally go marches. And I mean, I'm pro-life too, absolutely. I know God doesn't like abortion. But what about racism and murder and injustice? Like, why don't we have that same energy? That's what the young people are. Keep that same energy when it comes to some of these other issues. That makes so it's almost like the church has just decided what their agenda is going to be, and they're going to elect people that continue that agenda. They're going to invite those individuals into their church, kind of like that. What you were saying earlier, Crystal, that truth has become relative.
Yes.
And we just surround ourselves with a like-minded, equally yoked individuals who are never really gonna buck the system or ask those tough questions about what we're really doing here. And if you do, you get put out. Because we don't want to have those hard conversations from the top all the way through.
Listen,
I'm sorry, I'm getting hot.
You are, but listen, because I'm about to take you even further though. So, but is the church pro-life or are they pro-pregnancy? And pro-baby, because pro-life is from conception
the whole continuum.
Yeah.
Conception to the casket. That's pro-life.
Yeah.
So, no, they're not.
Then no, you're not. Then no, you're not.
But again,
that is where the conversation.
This is that truth I'm talking about, though. Right? This is it right here. Because churches don't want to have this conversation with their people. Because you start telling people that, they're going to leave. And if they leave, they take their money. And if they take their money, what happens to your church building, right? Okay, well, there's a problem right there. What have we made church? We hijacked
a corporation. Hold on. A corporation.
That it was never supposed to be.
That's the problem.
Okay, so once we institutionalized the church and we organized it and we put it inside of these nice, big, pretty expensive buildings, the government told us, okay, you can do that, but you can't speak to politics. And what did the church do? They said, oh, okay. And we shut up about all of it until the abortion movement happened, right? And then even in the church, 50% of people in the church aren't pro-life in any way. So it's kind of, but again, it's like we need to get back to preaching truth. Talking real truth. If you're going to say you're pro-life, you better be pro-life for every life.
Everybody,
and the longevity, whatever that money is, right? So that, like, I mean, why do we have senior care facilities? What happened to the family taking care of itself? Okay, I'll tell you what happened to the family taking care of itself. The church was supposed to be the model for family. One of the foundational tenets of salvation is this idea that the moment you walk into redemption, you are what? You are adopted into a family, a group of people that is supposed to protect you, that is supposed to teach you, that is supposed to cherish you, that is supposed to value you, that is supposed to show you that you're worthy, that is supposed to shore up your gate and build your wall around your identity so that there's never a question in your mind. Black, white, red, yellow, brown, doesn't matter. There's never a question in your mind as to who you are, because it doesn't have anything to do with what you look like. It doesn't have anything to do with where you come from. It simply has to do with the fact.
We in church now. Where's the offering plate? I want to
okay, like, and this is honestly, this is my thing, because when it comes to discipleship would have fixed this issue.
Now
and
that
ask me what the answer is today. Discipleship is the answer today. It was 2,000 years ago. It's the answer today.
But I will say with the discipleship piece, because I've been thinking a lot about you, because I know how passionate you are about the Great Commission, because that's what we're all called to do. It's not just, this is what Crystal and her husband feel called to know as believers. We're called to fulfill the Great Commission. But it is now more important than ever that we make sure these people that are discipling others know what real truth is.
Yes.
Because that's what you're talking about. Hurt people and broken people. Like I forget who it is, but you teach what you know, but you reproduce what you are. We talked about that at Dr. Ange's house during one of our late night chats. And that just is seared in my heart because that's what we're seeing. It's broken and hurting people have replicated that all throughout the earth. So we're talking about discipleship now, but we got to have some sort of a curriculum or just some sort of a like renewing of our minds so we know what we're discipling people into.
Yes.
And making sure that it's real truth and that people are strong and, you know, and know like who they are in Christ. And not in this political gospel, this racial gospel, this prosperity gospel, in the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Gospel.
Yes. And honestly, it starts with, and Francis Chan, honestly, is the champion of discipleship in our time. Yes. And he wrote a book titled Multiply. And the very first thing that he writes in the book is that there's one question that you have to ask yourself when you believe you're called to walk into discipleship, which every Christian should because we're commanded to. Exactly. I mean, the second you get saved, your new name is disciple. So, I mean, let's just start there. But then he makes it clear that if you make the decision to start walking into discipling others, to become that disciple maker that we're commanded to be, you have to ask yourself, why? Why do I want to be a disciple maker? Do I want to be a disciple maker so that I can impart my own perspective, my own view, my own experience with the gospel onto someone else because I think mine is worth talking about?
Superior. Yeah.
Or do I want to be a disciple maker because Christ called me to it, because Christ showed me what it's supposed to be, because I wanted to teach what Christ says that it is, and I want to show people what it means to really follow Jesus. And then he says the next thing is if you can answer those questions in the way that they should be, and it's all gospel centric, the next thing that he makes clear is if you don't love people, don't do it.
Listen, don't agree.
If you don't just simply love people,
but do we know what love is? I mean, because I think a lot of people say,
I love this podcast.
So I would say,
I'm sorry, we could go all night.
I know, right? But I would say there's two, and again, I like the way Patrick kind of identified it is Lencioni is number one, I have to have a basic care and concern for you as a person. And if I have a basic care and concern, then I have the ability to love you and have the ability to engage with you. But if I don't have either one of those, I have to fix it because I don't have trust and I don't have, there's a lack there that I need to figure out where is that lack coming from because at a minimum, right, we all should have basic care and concern for the fellow person standing next to me.
Yes.
Which means I care about what happens to you. I am concerned if you are not doing well.
Right.
So therefore, I'm going to end up loving you. I'm going to get you what you need. I'm going to ensure that nothing bad is happening to you. I'm going to try my best to actually engage with you and ensure that your well-being is being met because I have basic care and concern. That's how I'm able to show love. But if I don't have that, then no, I don't love. I don't love you. I don't care about you. I don't, and I think that's kind of where a lot of where the country is because they can look at something like with Mr. Floyd and say, I need more video. I need to know what he did. I need to know what drugs are in his body. I need to know what his criminal record is. And that's all fine and great. And he could have been the crazy criminal on Criminal Minds. The bottom line is,
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. I need basic care and concern that says you don't kill somebody in the street like a dog. That's the bare. That's like bare minimum.
I think when you're talking about the church too, that goes back to what Jesus talked about. You could have the gift of prophecy. You could, fathom all the mysteries, the spiritual mysteries, and have all this knowledge and have a huge mega church. You could be a mega church planter. You could be a theologian, the greatest theologian of our time. But if you don't have love, you have nothing.
You have nothing.
And I remember my pastor telling me this, and this is not like doom and gloom, and I'm not trying to condemn everybody to hell, but he's like, there might be a lot of people that held these titles and had all these, congregants and did all these great things in his name. But it'll be the grace of God that's going to ensure their salvation in heaven because they didn't have love. Yeah. They didn't have love. They did all these things in his name, but they didn't have the most foundational, fundamental piece that Jesus literally is the greatest example of. God is, Yeah. So I just wonder, that's why I posed the question to Crystal. Do we really know what love is? Or do we think it's just our work?
I don't
that
think
is love.
Honestly, and I talk about this all the time, and trust me, this conversation about the definition of love has gotten me into more trouble with church leaders, right, than anybody else that I've had this conversation with.
Wow.
Because
that's troubling, but okay.
Right? But we don't want to talk about the real truth of what real love looks like. Okay? So let's go to James. James made it very clear. If the plight of the poor and the widow and the oppressed does not move your heart to action, you are not saved. Period.
Wow.
Because if you are saved, you have experienced grace. You have experienced mercy. Grace and mercy instinctively respond to the poor, the widows, and the oppressed. It can't help itself. Okay, so if you have been redeemed and you have been covered with grace and mercy and the love of a Savior, you can't help yourself. So if you don't see those people, if you don't have, like Joanie says, a basic care for those people, you need to get back on your face and question whether or not the decision that you think you made, you actually made. Yeah, but nobody wants to talk about that truth because James, he didn't really mean it that way. It wasn't supposed to be literal. Okay, well, but that's what it says.
That's what it says.
It wasn't supposed to be literal.
That's
but
what it says.
This is the important, like what you just illustrated is to me, fundamental importance of why it's critical to have diversity of thought around the table. Yes. Because if you don't have people talking to you like that, you will, even with the right intentions, you will live your life doing all the Christian-y, literally, and never know that you didn't really have love because you were never around anybody that challenged your ideals of what it looks like in action. So I think that is such a powerful example of why we need to have diversity of thought around the table. We need to stop thinking we're monolithic here. We're not. And it's not going to come out of a homogenous congregation. That's not where the solutions are going to come from, period. We've seen what that can do, and this is where we are June 10th, 2020.
Right.
And you can't invite them to the table and shut them down and say, oh,
right,
thank you.
Right, kick you out. Like Chris,
then it's like you created this token person just to say I have representation.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
And Dr. Howe said that. He said that's how because I asked him, I said, how do you traverse this in your church? Like, I mean, it's great to say all these things, but he said, the very first thing he spoke is, I have a cross-functional team. I have people who are thought leaders at the table with me, who challenge, who ask the hard questions, who bring
so critical
different perspectives. And without that, I wholeheartedly believe him. I'm like, that's the first thing you do. We teach people, I know I do when I teach my teams how to, my folks in the plants, how to put teams together. That's the very first thing I tell them. It needs to be cross-functional. You can't have a whole team full of supervisors. You can't have a whole team full of just these people because all you're going to get is one perspective. So,
but the thing that we have to be careful of, though, is that environment can still exist in a multiracial team.
Okay.
Because if you have, I'm seeing it play out now.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm watching it in a specific arena of my life where the intentions are great. The heart of
Yeah.
it is great. But everybody at the table is a similar personality. They deal with conflict in a similar way. They handle conversation in a similar way. They think they're convinced that they're listening, okay?
Yeah.
But they're missing half the conversation. So that's part of where my struggle now comes in, is how do we help people that are convinced they're doing it right? See that there's still a huge gap in the way that they're operating.
Let me ask you this though. Sorry, I just want to know, because that's a profound question. I mean, we can all ask ourselves that, right?
Right.
But do you think that the events that have transpired over the last week that have sort of kind of unearthed generations of injustice, do you think that this is waking people up now, recognizing that maybe I haven't been doing things as right as I initially thought? Or are you saying this is just kind of playing out in more interpersonal, day-to-day activities in relationships?
I think that it's waking people up, but I think people are still missing that healthy communication piece.
Okay.
To where we're still afraid to speak about it the way that we really think about it. We're still afraid to confront it the way that we kind of know it needs to be confronted, but we're afraid to confront it that way because we don't want to cause offense and we don't want to feel offense.
And you asked, how can you tell whether or not you've fallen into groupthink? Because that's exactly what you described, right? Groupthink.
Good question.
We're all thinking the same thing, like, so we'll get everybody on board so that we're all safe. And really, groupthink is out of the intention of creating security and safety.
Yes.
So that's why people fall into that groupthink, because if we're all doing the same thing, even if it's the wrong thing, we're all doing it. So it's okay. And a good way to answer your question, a good way to know whether you've fallen into groupthink or not is if your team never has conflict, if your team never disagrees, if your team never has an opposing opinion, is a good way to know that you've fallen into that.
Well, I'll take a step further too, though, because there are teams that can recognize that, but if the opposing point of view never prevails, you also know you're involved in groupthink. Because if the opposing viewpoint is only ever stated but never actually enacted, you're still involved in groupthink. And that's part of what I think people don't realize, because that's what I'm talking about, right? People think that, okay, well, I'm giving the opposing point of view space to talk, right? But it's not changing what I've already decided in my mind to do. Okay, so
I love that meme. Yeah, I was just going to say, I love that meme that's going around, like, normalize changing your opinion when presented with new information. Like, it's okay. Now that this dissenting opinion has been elevated, you're like, oh, wow, what a revelation. It's okay to now have a changed mindset. You know, we're not married to these ideals. The Bible, yes. But anything after that is completely up for discussion, period.
Even the Bible, if I speak something that's inaccurate, someone please tell me. Like, if I totally pick a scripture totally is not correct, by God, someone loved me enough to tell me, right? Like, that's how I have approached pretty much every moment of ministry in my life. Just tell me.
You're awesome.
I would rather be confronted and then have the opportunity to repent and walk in obedience than to remain ignorant.
Girl, and a simple example of that, I'm sorry, Joanie, I'm not setting you up here. I'll just bring some levity here. Is if I have something in my teeth or in my nose, please let me know. I absolutely detest when I've been talking to people all afternoon, I go into the restroom and I've got sound in my teeth. Like, nobody loves me enough to just call me on the side. Hey, hon, so it's a simple and funny example, but it's true. Like, love me enough to correct me when I'm in the wrong, in love. for my good, you know? And we also have to recognize that we have to create safe spaces where people feel like they can do that, and it's not going to offend you and cause you, you know, to go on this tailspin because somebody is calling you out. So I think it is both sides, but we're all mature enough believers in this podcast to know if I'm wrong, call me out. I'm giving you permission. That's the model in the Bible as well, and why discipleship is so incredibly important, you know, too, because it gives you that insight. So I just had to bring up that.
Right, but then this takes us all the way back to the very initial question of this conversation, is that we all approach conflict through our own lens. So someone can be doing it in love, and we can receive it completely out of context. Right? So
very true.
Again, like, this is one of those issues that, and I probably sound like a broken record to so many people in my life, but I'm laying this at the feet of the church.
Yeah.
We are the ones that should have known better. We are the ones that should have been teaching each other and confronting each other in love our entire lives. We are the ones that should have been working out how to have these confrontations in a healthy way and then still love. But the reality is that the church looks no different than the world around it when it comes to confrontation.
And when it comes to most things at this point.
Oh, right, exactly.
I mean, this is not to hate on the church. You know, we all love the church. We serve the church. You know, we are the church.
And the church is God's chosen vehicle. So let's work together to fix it.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's do better. Yes.
But we need all perspectives to fix it, right?
We need the body.
We can't, as a white church, be like, oh, we can fix this. And as a black church, oh, we're going to fix it this way.
It's not going to come from the
place. We're going to end up in the same place.
Yeah.
We all need to figure out a way to set politics aside, to set cultural preferences aside, and come to a table with Christ at the center, where the focus is simply, how do we fix this biblically? What does it look like for us to start rebuilding what we've allowed to be torn down? Right? Whether it's a burned piece, whether it's a crushed piece, whether it's a broken piece, whether it's just simply a separation in the wall, whatever it is, right? Because I'm going to come back to Nehemiah, right? If the church cannot figure out and realize that we need to rebuild our own walls, rebuild our own gates, we are never going to be able to help the community around us do that very thing. And so that's what needs to happen.
That's right. So as we close out, I just want to hear from each one of you, one thing we need to be seeking, one thing we need to be asking, and one door we need to be knocking on so that we can make practical change. Seeking, asking, knocking.
So I would say we need to be seeking Jesus, the Lord, in all things. We need to be asking, Lord, how can I help? What's my lane? Where have you called me to make the biggest impact? And then when we know where he's called us, we need to be knocking on those doors, you know, whether it's our friends and our family members or our colleagues or the doors of the church or wherever, you know, or in, you know, a state capitol building, wherever he's called you to make that impact, you need to start knocking on those doors. And you know, so you get an answer.
How about you, Chris?
I think I would start with, I mean, we all need to start seeking real personal relationship with the Spirit. Because the Spirit is the one that speaks, right? So we all need to be seeking personal relationship with the Spirit, whatever that looks like. Because I know there's argument in the church over what that looks like. So we can come to a consensus about that. Jesus help us. But I think we all need to be seeking personal relationship with the Spirit. In a way that we're not afraid to actually hear what's spoken, right? I think we need to be asking of ourselves first, right? What is it that's in me that needs dug out, that needs repented of, that needs confronted, that needs completely removed, so that I can fix that place in my wall, so that I can close that gate and I can move on to the next thing. Right? Because it all starts with us. If we can't fix ourselves, then we can't be part of a group. or not fix ourselves. If we can't seek the Spirit and then allow Spirit to convict us to repentance when we're asking what needs to be dug out, then we're already behind people, right? And then knocking, I think we all need to be knocking on the doors of the people in our life that are different than us. And we need to be asking them, do you mind having a conversation about this with me? Can we talk about this specific thing? Can we talk about what's happening in the country as far as racism goes? Can we talk about, I mean, if it's something scriptural, I read this in my Bible, can we talk about this? Yeah. Right? We need to get back to this idea that like faith is supposed to happen in community. It's not supposed to happen in isolation. It doesn't work in isolation, right? The only way faith works is if it's happening in community. Right. So we need to be knocking on the doors of the people around us that we have already given, entry into our space. Say, I really need to have this conversation. Are you willing to have it with me? And if you can't find anybody in your circle that's willing to have it, go knock on your neighbor's door. But knock, like start, I mean, like figuratively knocking, but like also like really start having these conversations, because if you don't, you can be seeking and you can be asking all day long, but if you don't ever start knocking, you're going to be in this same place 10 years from now.
Yes.
And that would be such a travesty.
Yes, it would be.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. That was such an amazing talk. A welcome from the both of you. You were able to provide so much impact and perspective from both of you. And I just thank you for joining me here on Purpose Coaching. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Make sure you find my name, On Purpose Planning and Consulting. Like the video, subscribe, and make sure you hit that notification button so you can get new videos. And remember, we challenge you to do better on purpose.